Okay, well, I'm Dan Royer, and my major area of concentration is community college leadership. The cognate was adult and community education. And I'm going to be a little bit different, I think, because my dissertation was solely qualitative. Um, Quantitative was a piece, I think, both Karen and Rob's dissertation. So for me, I sat back and I thought about what the process was like. I imagined at the beginning of the dissertation process this gigantic project, and it was a big project, but one of the things that I took away from the whole process was the need to narrow everything that I did. So when I started this, I had this picture in my mind of what it might be, and I had to start drawing down, if you will, funneling down, narrowing down, focusing down the topic. And the topic itself was pretty much focused on institutional culture, but it was also this way of doing things, appreciative inquiry, that was a part of that. But how did I draw down the focus? Well, I started with a case study. At least that was my initial thought. Was I'm going to do this case study, and it's going to be a big case study, and the institution is the case. Well, the institution is too big to be a case. It was just unmanageable to think of it that way. So as I started thinking about the process of narrowing that, I began to look for access points where I could actually go in and take some do some interviews, do some observations, and that sort of thing, and actually get access into the case itself. And so these became what I called micro cases. And so my study was of an institution, but there were 3 micro cases in that study. And that was one area focusing on teaching and learning, and that was learning communities. The second one was student life, and the third one was in the area of leadership. So in each of those micro cases, I had access points to different elements in the study. And over the course, I was writing notes about what I did, and I was thinking about this, and it was a lot bigger than I thought it was going to be when I went into it. But I did the 12 interviews with people in each one of the micro cases. That translated into 211 pages of single-space transcription. And I don't know if you've ever thought about managing that much data, but that was a lot. And then I did observations, wrote notes, and I had over 40 pages of single-spaced observations. And then because it was a case study, I also gathered archival documents to look at. And I had somewhere around 260 pages of archival documents. So when you start amassing that much data, then you have to narrow it even more. This was just from my limited micro cases, okay? So once I got to that limitation, then I got the data, and the data was this massive set of data. And so I started into the process of coding and analysis in a way to bring that focus down a little bit. And the coding and analysis period was, when I went into it, it was a little bit ambiguous. I didn't know exactly how this was going to work itself out. I had all this data, and I had a general feeling of what I perceived, but I wanted to have the data tell me what it was. So, and approach it that way. So as I narrowed it down, and as I looked through the data, and I coded it, and I began to process it, then it began to seem to broke apart, and it seemed to narrow down. So again, it was another process of narrowing it down, and finally I arrived at 4 findings and 11 sub-findings. So, I mean, that was a big, if you think about it, that's a lot of narrowing when you look at where I began. The other point I want to make here, and I think I didn't realize how important this was when I went into it, and I realized it over the process, how significant, especially in qualitative study, the methodology can act as a way to draw you back in to narrow it down. So that the methodology was critical for me to think about how I was going to narrow this down. So it was the central, I didn't understand this in the beginning, but Dr. Latz once mentioned a plumb line for me in my dissertation. And that plumb line became my epistemology, my methodology, and my interpretive framework. And all 3 of those had to mesh, they had to interact, and they had to align with each other in order for the study to actually result in the findings that I had. So I think that I looking back at it, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to get the epistemology, methodology, and all that sorted out. And then when you get into the data collection, recognize you're going to get all this data, and then you're going to have to work through some of that. If it's a qualitative study, your methodology will tell you how you're going to gather the data and what you're going to collect. So, and the interpretive framework is an important piece of that as well. So, all of that said, coming out with the dissertation in the end product, making the move from the data to the end written dissertation product was a journey in itself. And that, I think, is just something that when I went into it, I didn't have enough patience thinking about what it would take. I thought, okay, I ended my field work in January. I thought I'm going to have this dissertation done in June and have everything wrapped up. Well, I had a product in June, but it wasn't the finished product. It wasn't complete, really. It took a little more time for me to process that and actually get what I was happy with as a finished product. So I guess what I would say about that is just the narrowing down, and then after you even get the data and you start going through the process, allow time. And it did take me a year from beginning to end to get the dissertation complete. I started field work in the fall, and I completed it. So basically, I think that's all I wanted to really kind of share. I hope that was what you were looking for.
My name's Rob Matthews, and I guess the first thing I would say is, and this is especially applicable to you, Sharon, and probably you, Rosa, is you want to have your eye on the end prize, but I think you have to kind of change your finish lines. Mm-hmm. I think you have to say, okay, this semester, finishing these 2 or 3, 4 classes, whatever it is the finish line right now. And finishing these comps and finishing this proposal and collecting this data and analyzing it and writing it up and then defending it. You have to view those all as finish lines, because if you only have your eye on the end, the very end finish line, it's really hard to kind of win those battles. But if you stay focused on the now with an eye for a little peak, like you think of, I don't know, my wife has this phrase she uses for our cats when they do she calls it like a peek and do. I don't know what that means, but have a little glimpse at the end, because strategically you want to be doing work that points to that. I think is really important. But if you don't have shorter finish lines, it can be really overwhelming, and you will get there. There's no doubt about that. It's just you really have to focus on really short-term attainable goals. So that's just a little tidbit out the gates. But my process, I used most of the clock. I had a year remaining, and so it took 6.5 years basically. And mine was all quantitative, and so I was able to use a lot of my comp work in my dissertation, which I think is really helpful. It's something you really should be thinking about. And the really good thing is, with our leadership, they do a really good job of nudging you in that direction. So, or sometimes like picking you up and putting you in that direction. So if you're not listening, so I think we're really fortunate, the leadership that we have. So, but the process for me, I was going into classrooms and doing interventions basically, and it ended up being I had done this in my own classes for years, and I knew there was value, but to do it in someone else's classroom and depend on other people, that's something you really need to plan out and think about and have contingency plans, because you get some interesting surprises, and I totally forgot to have my students take the pretest, and so stuff happens, and you kind of have to be ready for alternatives. You have to really have that stuff planned out in your head. But I would do a one class intervention where we looked at creativity and how open were students to the ideation process. And then the next class session, so I was kind of modeling this either on a night class model or a Tuesday, Thursday type, hour and 15-minute type class. And then the next class session, I would go in and we would do a new venture ideation process, start individually and then morph into teams. And I have a lot of data beyond what I used in my dissertation, which is something to think about too if you have the opportunity to do that. I'm kind of always thinking ahead, what can I use later? But it was a lot of data. A very different type of data than Dan, but what you kind of learn is data's data. You do have to narrow it and reduce it. And it's really easy to fall in love with all of it, but you have to narrow it down to what can be meaningful to people, what they'll actually read and digest. So I had a pre-test and a post-test survey. And then, of course, in the pre, I had demographics and kind of identifier information. And so I think the pre-test was like 65-ish questions, and there were some sub-questions in there. And then the post was maybe 45-ish or something. And then I had another instrument. I used a problem-solving style instrument or inventory that I had built into that. So, it was a lot of questions, and getting students to kind of stick with it. And so it's how you prep them. You don't want to lead them too much, but you do need to kind of explain that, hey, there's a lot of questions, but it'll go really fast. So, but then the statistics came, okay? And I have a business background. I had taken 2 business stats classes that I barely got through. So it's not really my thing. I thought Dr. Holmes Finch, I had him for an online section through this program, which was really good. I learned more in that class in probably a week than I did my other 2 stats classes. So that helped, but then when you get into the real numbers, it's a little different story. It's totally overwhelming. But I'll tell you, Keandre was really helpful, and I spent many hours in his office. So the next thing I would say is, you can't do this alone. You have to seek out expertise. People will invest in you, and you're going to give that back someday to other people. But you have to, and you'll have a passion for giving it back because of what was given to you. But you have to seek out people who can help you understand. And what you'll find is different people will help you understand different pieces. It's a perspective thing. And their language or the way they say it will just connect with you. And so I remember meeting a professor on the track that was doing a workout. Hey, can we go over stats? And he's like, bring it on. We'll do it in between. When I'm resting. And so I had to be patient. I remember going to someone's house and someone's office, and you just piece all this together to where you form your own view of it. But that was very qualitative in nature, actually, and experience. But it's just go humble yourself to go find experts and people who have expertise and experience, and lean on that, and then you'll get to give it back someday. So I'm sure most of you have read like a chapter 4 and the results section in a academic paper, and it's like quantitative now. It's like, okay, try not to nod off, right? I mean, it's even harder to write it. I remember talking to Dr. Wessel and saying, I feel like I'm just saying the same thing over and over again. And he literally said, just start alternating the way you say it, every other result. Mm-hmm. And it's just what it is. It is what it is, It's like a commercial, it is what it is. So you just have to grind through some of that. But the end results, it's interesting that you'll get things you didn't expect, which is why we do this, right? It's a discovery, which is really fun. I mean, you get to see things that you never would have guessed, that weren't even on your radar, that you maybe weren't even passionate about necessarily. And it's, for me, having coached students in entrepreneurship classes for like 15, 17 years, it totally flipped my perspective on some things. Like, oh, okay. Now I'm starting to have a little bit of an understanding of why maybe female students were not as assertive in our classes. It's like, okay, well, maybe because there were only 2 of 15 or 3 of 15 or something. But then you start to say, okay, maybe we didn't do such a good job of connecting with them. And so I think that the discovery is what's so cool about it. Like you've created something that is unique. I mean, it has your signature all over it. So in those short finish lines, think about that. Every class, you are creating pieces that are unique to you. It's your perspective. And perspective is a beautiful thing. If everybody would start to embrace that in this country, how much different would things be? Yeah. So that would be my big takeaway. But I think the whole process is just there are pieces you're going to have to grind out. I mean, like Dan said, and you're going to have to wrestle with yourself a little bit and what you want to do with this and how you want to narrow it down. And so I think that's some of the biggest takeaways I would have.
That's awesome. I'm Karen Hanson-Morgan, and my emphasis was higher education and my cognitive communication studies. And I have to echo what both Dan and Rob were saying about the narrowing down process. but I think and as well as the um, taking it in taking your process in small chunks rather than approaching it as this one big whole. It's kind of like the joke about how you eat an elephant. One bite at a time. Attempt it to do it all at once. But I think that for me, the narrowing down process occurred while I was thinking about what I wanted to do for my dissertation. So my process happened prior to my proposal. Initially, my study was spirituality and grit and their relationship to each other and impact on persistence to graduation. And I was very interested in spirituality because of my personal background. And so when I started into the doctoral program, I had this kind of big vision of what I wanted to look at and research. And as I took classes, then I would find pieces of information that kind of helped me go, okay, spirituality is huge. What aspects of spirituality do I really want to look at? And I did certificates along with my major and my cognate. And one of the certificates I did was in institutional research, and I worked in the Office of Institutional Effectiveness, and that's what we do. So when I took the institutional research course that is part of that certificate, I did a retention study where we looked at the variables that influence retention from the freshman year to the sophomore year. And we looked at a lot of things, and when you're looking at retention, the obvious answers are always GPA and the number of credits that you took and but the problem with those obvious answers is by the time you know the obvious answer, you don't know what's influencing that. And so as our secondary question was, what are the precursors to GPA? What are the things that are influencing these obvious academic reasons for progression? So as we looked at that, we took all kinds of data. We do surveys called MapWorks at Ball State. Ball State actually was the one that designed and implemented that survey. Now it's a national survey and it's owned by another company, but we use MapWorks survey. We use the National Survey of Student Engagement, or NSSE. So we took all of that survey data as well as academic information that the university keeps, and demographic information. We looked at housing. We looked at all of the different clubs that students are engaged in. We took specific courses that we know are fail courses, like math courses, the part of the general education that, if students aren't passing these classes, then we know they're not going to progress. So we have this big data set that we pulled together, and one of the findings was that spiritual engagement was influencing persistence from the freshman year to the sophomore year. And to me, that was fascinating. And then another course that I took with Dr. Latz, we did an autoethnography of our own personal undergraduate experience. And I found, by this time I had discovered the work that is being done on grit. And I found in my personal experience that spirituality and grit interacted with each other and drove my personal motivation to persist and to eventually graduate. And so out of those two separate classes came my research question is my personal experience being reflected in the general population? And so so that was kind of the way that I narrowed down my original big broad idea of, okay, this is the area that I want to study. You know, I finally came up with a couple of variables that were very relatively specific. I mean, spirituality is still not really well defined, and grit is still in the process of being defined. So those were the two things that I wanted to look at, and my concern wasn't the semester to semester retention or persistence, but the longevity of, can we actually, you know, what drives students to actually get to the point of walking out of the university with a diploma in hand. So that's kind of where I started, and I had a sense of, you know, Dan talked about methodology, and that, you know, the research courses that we take really help us dig into what kind of methodologies are available to us and what kind of methodologies and philosophical approaches are appropriate for the kind of research that we're interested in doing. So as I approached this, I kind of had a sense that grounded theory was a really good fit, and my committee pushed back really, really hard. And so as this is becoming well acquainted enough with literature and the area that you're thinking about, the approach, the methodology that you're thinking about, that you can sit in front of your committee and have a strong enough defense that they're going to buy off on that. And so as I was working through my proposal, you know, I had gone to International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry for several years, and I had attended some of the workshops that they do there on grounded theory, read a lot of books, went back into the literature with Strasser and really explored, you know, the principles and the foundation, as well as the grounded theory 2 and all of the things that have come out of that. So that when I sat in front of my committee and said, this is what I want to do, even though they pushed back, they still signed off on it. And I think that that's really a very important part of your process when you're sitting in that proposal defense, that you can defend everything that you're doing. So my data was very different from both what Dan and Rob did, because I was doing an accumulation of data that was already in existence, and it wasn't specifically directed to the research question that I was asking. So it's a thing, it's called secondary data analysis. It's a very legitimate thing, and the nice thing about it is it allows you to dig into what basically would amount to a longitudinal study that you don't have the time to do in a doctoral program. So I had 10 years of data on every entering freshman cohort to graduation from 2004 to 2014, so that we could actually analyze their success at meeting a 4, 5, or 6 year time to graduation process. And as I said, I use a similar data set to the one that I did for the retention study, except that we had expanded it to include that 10 years of data, and we had expanded it to include graduation information, retention from semester to semester across the board, dropout, you know, just a lot of stuff was going on here. So when I got to the point after proposal, there were specific things that I needed included in that data set that we had not included in previous data sets that my office had put together. So I went back to my boss and to our data analysts and said, okay, this is what I need. Well, the situation in my office was we were 2 analysts short, and the one that we had was brand new, and so she was trying to do the work of 3 people, and keep all and respond to all of the things that our brand new president and U.S. News and World Report and all of these different survey requests that we get in daily. So even though I had a partial data set, but I didn't have everything that I needed, it took approximately 6 months for them to pull together the data set that I needed. So that's another thing that you really have to, plan into your timeline. Is even though you think, oh, the data is already there, somebody just has to pull it together, there may be things happening in the office that you are asking to pull it together. I was intimately familiar with everything that was going on, so I completely understood.
Right.
But if you're asking an office that you aren't even associated with to pull something together, they may be even less responsive than mine was, and mine was, having a difficult time pulling it together. So, so I took every last minute of my 7 years to finish. Dr. Wessel was like, you time out in December. I was like, I'm very aware. So, I proposed in May of 2016, and I walked December of 2017. So, with all of the things that are going on, and I'm a technical writer by profession, so for me, getting to the writing stage was like, once I get to the point where my data is all analyzed and I just have to sit down and write, that went relatively quickly for me. But getting the data took about 6 months. My brain is a qualitative brain. It's not a quantitative brain, but I can do quantitative things because I've been trained. But to sit down and statistically analyze the data above and beyond the normal mean and mode and median that we all are intimately familiar with. My dissertation committee and had suggested that I go back and get some experts to weigh in on the variable, what I was using from the surveys to represent my variables. So because MapWorks was developed here, I had a contact, and I contacted the person who was in charge of developing MapWorks. And because I worked in institutional effectiveness and have attended a lot of their different conferences in association with my office, I had a contact with the person who developed Nessie. And so I had really good experts weigh in on the data that I was using, and they made some specific recommendations about what I should use to represent my variables, and they made specific suggestions about how I should analyze those variables in order to strengthen my claim that they were legitimate. That required statistical analysis that I had not done before. And so it took me, I got my data in January a year ago, and it took me from January to May to really wrestle with that data and figure out what on earth I was doing. And there were many times when I questioned what I had got myself into, because statistical analysis, even though I've taken multiple statistics classes, I can take the class and I walk out, and if I don't do it every day, in 2 months it's gone. And so I have to sit back down with the book and wrestle with, okay, what is it I'm really trying to understand, and what statistical approach is it that I need to use here? So that's something that you really need to be prepared when you finally have that data is, there will be days when you get up and you look at it and it makes perfect sense what you need to do, and you'll go to bed and the next morning you'll wake up and you go, what on earth was I thinking here? So, documentation of why you're doing something a specific way to help you remember that when you've slept a little bit is really important. And
Or you haven't slept.
pardon?
Or you haven't slept.
Either one will contribute to brain fog. And I have fibromyalgia, and that really contributes to brain fog. And so, and that was another part of my struggle. So it took me from January to May to really wrestle with that data. And again, Dr. Wessel is providing me with kind but firm notes, a reminder about how I'm missing deadlines, and are you really doing what you're supposed to be doing, and I'm sending him back, yes, I'm very aware, and this is where I'm at, and oh, would you like to see the 200 tables that I put together already? Because that's where I was at, with all of these, I couldn't compare cohort to cohort. I had to compare cohort within each cohort. And then once that was done, then I could say, okay, this particular variable is occurring at this particular percentage in this particular cohort, and then in this particular cohort we see it at a similar percentage. And so, once I'd done each of the cohorts, then I could compare them across the entire spectrum of the 10 years that I had. Like I said, we're talking close to 200 tables. There may be more. I lost count after a while. But once Dr. Wessel was reassured that I really was making progress, everything was okay on that point of view, and I got all of my data analyzed, and then I just started writing. And he was like, okay, I need to see your chapter 4 by this date. So I got it back to him. And then he said, okay, I need to see chapter 5 by this date. So I got it back to him. And, by that time, he's like, okay, now I see the issue, and yes, we're making progress. And so my rewrites were minimal, again, because of my training in technical writing. The writing process for me was so much easier than all of the other stuff. That may not be the same for you, so don't say, oh, that's going to be easy because Karen said it was going to be easy, because I can tell you, I've been doing this for 40 years, and so I have a little bit of expertise in writing. So I defended early September. Actually, it wasn't early September. I defended the 28th of September. And my committee was delighted with what I had done. And I walked out of that with a theory and a model of the intersection between spirituality and grit, and a way that it can be applied and demonstrated to impact persistence to graduation, as well as ideas of how it might influence other types of things when we're looking at like social work, other fields where motivation and persistence are important. So I feel like out of the scope of a initially multiple method approach of quantitative and qualitative, narrowing it down to primarily quantitative with a little bit of qualitative analysis of open-ended responses that we had to surveys. I still felt like I came out with a really strong product and a vision of what can be done with this information to enable us to help our students persist better in education as well as persist in other aspects of their lives.